Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled to have you joining us today.
We really are.
Because if you're tuning in, you're likely the kind of professional who isn't satisfied with just knowing that a system is online. You want to understand the invisible architecture.
The structural integrity.
Exactly. The deep-level mechanics that actually guarantee that system is telling the truth. Today, we are focusing on a critical, behind-the-scenes discipline that essentially acts as the immune system for our entire global digital economy.
Which sounds like a massive claim, but it really isn't an exaggeration.
No, it's not. We are looking at information technology audit sampling.
Okay.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a highly technical and frankly fascinating document to guide us today.
We certainly do. We are dissecting a very specific authoritative framework. It's ISACA's ITAF Companion Performance Guidelines for Information Technology Audit Sampling.
Quite a mouthful.
It is. But what makes this particular guideline so compelling is that it bridges the gap between theoretical mathematics and the chaotic, high-stakes reality of modern IT environments.
Right.
This is the operational playbook used by assurance professionals worldwide to verify that the system's processing massive volumes of financial transactions, securing our health records, protecting corporate intellectual property to make sure those are functioning exactly as designed.
And our mission for this deep dive is to map out that exact journey. We want to guide you through exactly how IT auditors confront these oceans of data. I mean, we are talking about environments with millions of concurrent system logs, labyrinthine cloud configurations, thousands of dynamic user access rights.
It's overwhelming just to think about.
Right, so how do you draw an ironclad, mathematically defensible conclusion about that ocean without examining every single drop of water? It is an incredibly powerful skill.
Yeah.
But before we get into the nuts and bolts of sample design and risk modeling, we should probably ground ourselves in who is actually setting these rules.
That's essential context.
Yeah. ISIS is a foundational pillar in this space. They have over half a century of experience, a global community pushing 200,000 members across nearly 200 countries.
Which is a scale that really reflects the stakes involved here. ISA's core mandate is advancing what they refer to as digital trust.
Digital trust.
Yes. If you consider how the modern world operates, every supply chain, every financial market, every piece of critical infrastructure, it's entirely dependent on interconnected digital systems. Trust is no longer a localized concept. It is the fundamental currency of the global economy.
Because if that trust degrades...
Exactly. If we cannot definitively prove that a database is secure or a ledger is accurate, the cascading effects are catastrophic. The professionals utilizing this framework, working across information security, governance, risk, privacy, they are the frontline defenders of that trust. And this specific companion guideline is one of their most precise diagnostic tools.
So for the first part of our discussion today, we want to try something a little different. Because the foundation of this framework is so crucial, we thought it would be highly effective to approach the opening concepts as a pair of instructors.
I like this approach.
Yeah, we want to walk you through the foundational elements established in the first chapter of the guidelines, taking it one topic at a time in its original logical sequence. Consider this a masterclass on the architecture of IT auditing.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the scaffolding itself. We all know ITAF is the backbone of IT audit standards. But how does this specific document fit into that massive framework?
Well, the guidelines define the information technology audit framework as doing three critical things. It sets standards for practitioner ethics and roles. It defines the specific vocabulary of IT auditing, and it provides concrete techniques for planning and executing the work.
So that framework acts essentially as the constitution for the profession.
That's a great way to put it. It provides the absolute boundaries. But a constitution requires specific operational laws to help professionals navigate the nuances of daily execution.
And that's where Guideline 2208 comes in.
Precisely. That is the role of this companion guideline. Its stated purpose is to support practitioners in applying sampling methods to draw valid, defensible conclusions when they are testing less than 100% of a given population.
Testing less than 100%.
Right. It is designed to enforce a consistent, risk-based methodology across the entire life cycle of a sample, from the initial design through the selection process and into the final evaluation. The ultimate objective is to drastically strengthen the reliability and the transparency of the audit evidence being collected.
I noticed an interesting structural detail in how they categorize these documents. Even though this specific guideline doesn't map to just one single overarching standard, its numbering system 2208 tells you exactly where you are in the ITF universe.
The numbering is very intentional.
Yeah. The 2000 series is dedicated to general guidance, the 2400 series handles reporting, and the 2200 series is all about performance. So the moment you see that 2200 designation, you know you are looking at tactical, boots-on-the-ground performance guidance.
It is about the actual execution of the audit, which is exactly where the theory meets reality. It is meant to complement the broader standards that govern how an audit is planned and reported.
Right.
But within this introductory chapter, there is a fundamental philosophical stance that we, as your instructors for this segment, need to highlight.
Oh yes, the recommended part.
Yes. The framework explicitly states that adherence to these specific sampling guidelines is recommended but not mandatory.
Now, for a professional who might be accustomed to rigid compliance checkboxes, that phrasing often causes a double take.
It really does.
I mean, why would a global authority invest thousands of hours developing a meticulous, mathematically rigorous framework only to explicitly state that practitioners are not strictly bound to follow it?
What's fascinating here is that the answer revolves entirely around the concept of professional judgment.
That is the part that really stood out to me. It acknowledges that an IT auditor isn't just an algorithm executing a script. They are highly trained investigators operating in highly unpredictable environments. But there is a major caveat attached to that flexibility, isn't there?
A massive one. The guidelines absolutely empower the practitioner to exercise flexibility and to deviate from the recommended procedures if the specific context of the IT environment demands it. However,
There's always a however.
always, the immediate counterweight to that freedom is absolute accountability. If you choose to deviate from the framework, you must properly justify and meticulously document that deviation.
You can't just skip a step because it's hard.
No. You cannot simply bypass a recommended sampling technique because it is computationally heavy or procedurally inconvenient.
Correct.
You must articulate a professionally sound, technically defensible rationale based on the unique risk profile of the system you are evaluating.
And put it in writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You must commit that rationale to the formal audit record so that any subsequent reviewer or regulatory body can follow your logic. The framework serves as the definitive baseline. If you alter the baseline, the burden of proof is entirely on you.
It is a brilliant balance, really. It gives the auditor the necessary agility to handle the messy, bespoke realities of enterprise IT while enforcing an incredibly high standard of documentation. If you are going to go off the established trail, you have to draw a flawless map of exactly why you took the detour and how you navigated it.
That's exactly how it functions in practice.
And speaking of the reality of enterprise IT, the opening sections also tackle the massive elephant in the room. Technology has fundamentally mutated since the early days of auditing.
It's unrecognizable.
The framework explicitly addresses why this particular update was necessary, noting that modern audits are conducted in highly complex, data-driven, technology-enabled environments.
The historical context here is vital for understanding the weight of these guidelines. If you look back a few decades, auditing was a highly physical endeavor.
Paper everywhere.
Exactly. An auditor might walk into a secure records room filled with massive steel filing cabinets. Sampling literally meant pulling every 20th paper invoice from a drawer, running a finger down the column, and verifying a physical ink signature.
Wow. The physical constraints naturally limited the scope of the sample. Contrast that with the environments covered by this modern framework. Today, we are talking about IT general controls, spanning distributed global data centers.
Right.
We are looking at application controls embedded inside microservices architectures and continuous cybersecurity monitoring systems that generate terabytes of telemetry every single hour.
It's a completely different universe.
The sheer scale and velocity of the environments have changed the very nature of what it means to gather evidence.
Let's ground this for our listeners. Imagine you are leading an assurance engagement for a major global fintech platform. Let's call them Global Tech. Their core ledger processes 50 million microtransactions a day across 3 different cloud providers.
A very realistic scenario.
You obviously cannot perform a manual review of every transaction to ensure the encryption protocol is fired correctly every single time. You need a highly sophisticated, mathematically reliable framework to prove to the regulators that the system is functioning securely. And that is exactly the scenario these guidelines are engineered to address.
But the framework makes a very pointed observation. While the environment is digital, automated, and unimaginably vast, the core principles of the profession remain static.
That is a crucial distinction. The tools we use to extract and analyze data have evolved exponentially, but the fundamental mission has not moved an inch.
The mission is the same.
The requirement to exercise skeptical professional judgment, the mandate to gather sufficient and appropriate evidence, and the absolute necessity of maintaining sound, reproducible documentation, those are invariant principles.
They don't change just because the data is in the cloud now.
Right. The framework adapts the application of these principles to a cloud-native world, but it does not dilute the principles themselves.
I think that brilliantly concludes our masterclass on the foundation. We have established what ITAF is. We see how the performance guidelines operate within it. We understand the vital tension between recommended practices and professional judgment. And we recognize the massive technological shift driving these standards.
Which naturally leads us into the core operational question the framework poses. To sample or not to sample?
A big question.
That is the pivotal crossroad of any engagement. Before we even discuss methodology, we have to define our terms clearly.
Let's do it.
The framework relies on a very precise definition of audit sampling from Appendix C. It is the application of audit procedures to less than 100% of the items within a population for the specific purpose of obtaining evidence about a particular characteristic of that entire population.
So you were examining a carefully chosen fragment to deduce the reality of the whole.
Exactly. But the framework immediately forces the practitioner to confront the inherent limitations of this approach.
Because reviewing every single piece of information is often just a physical and temporal impossibility, right? I mean, if global tech is generating 50 terabytes of firewall log data a month, a human team cannot read it.
They cannot.
Even a basic script might take days to parse it effectively without overwhelming the production servers. But the framework brings up a really interesting nuance beyond just the sheer volume of data, the issue of timeliness and relevance.
Timeliness is often the silent killer of a well-designed audit.
How so?
Well, the framework explicitly warns that relying on outdated information can completely invalidate your conclusions, particularly in rapidly evolving IT environments. Let's say you are auditing global tech's cloud infrastructure security in November.
Okay.
If you pull a sample of user access provisioning requests from February, your evidence might be entirely disconnected from the current reality.
Because things change so fast.
Exactly. Perhaps in July, the company migrated to a completely new zero-trust architecture and overhauled their entire identity and access management system. Testing those February logs tells you absolutely nothing about the security posture in November.
Wow. Yeah, that makes total sense.
If the data is not strictly relevant to the current operational state, the sample is worthless before you even begin testing.
It is a phenomenal point. The data has a shelf life. So, assuming we have relevant, timely data, and we have established that a 100% review is impossible, the framework outlines 4 distinct sampling methods to reach those valid conclusions.
Yes.
I want to unpack these carefully, starting with statistical sampling. The framework describes this as a probability-based selection method.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, statistical sampling is the mathematical gold standard, when your objective is to project your findings across the entire population with a quantifiable degree of certainty.
It removes the guesswork.
It removes human intuition entirely and replaces it with probability theory. It is the method you employ when you need to state, mathematically, that you are 95% confident that the error rate in the entire system is between 2 and 4%.
So what does that look like in practice?
A classic example from the text would be selecting a purely random sample of, say, 250 user access modification tickets from a full fiscal year. Because the selection is strictly random and mathematically representative, you can evaluate those 250 tickets and legally project the compliance failure rate to the tens of thousands of tickets you didn't look at.
The math provides the cover.
Exactly.
And then the framework introduces non-statistical sampling. And I have to admit, when I first encountered this concept, it felt a bit counterintuitive.
Oh.
Yeah. If statistical sampling gives us mathematical certainty, why would we ever use a method that relies entirely on the auditor's professional judgment? Isn't that just opening the door to human bias?
It is a highly debated topic, but non-statistical sampling serves an entirely different, yet equally vital purpose. You are correct that it does not allow for mathematical projection. You cannot test 10 items non-statistically and make a mathematical claim about the whole population. However, statistical sampling is blind. It assumes every item has an equal chance of being selected. Non-statistical sampling leverages the most powerful analytical tool available, the deeply seasoned intuition of an expert practitioner.
So it's about trusting the human.
Yes. It acknowledges that an auditor who has spent a decade looking at IT systems knows exactly where the architecture is most fragile.
I see. So it is about targeted investigation rather than broad representation.
Precisely. To use an example, let's say Global Tech acquired a smaller startup in May and rapidly integrated their highly privileged developer accounts into the main production environment.
Always a messy process.
An experienced auditor knows that post-merger integration is a massive risk vector for access control failures. So instead of randomly sampling user changes across the whole year, they might intentionally select 100% of the privileged account changes that occurred specifically during the 2 weeks following the merger.
They aren't trying to estimate the error rate for the year.
No. They are using their judgment to focus intense scrutiny on a known high-risk event to quickly confirm whether the controls held up under pressure.
That makes perfect sense. It is the difference between conducting a random public health survey across a whole city versus sending an elite medical team straight to the epicenter of a reported outbreak.
That's a fantastic analogy. Both are necessary, but they serve different goals.
You know, it reminds me of how often in life we use non-statistical sampling, like tasting a spoonful of soup to judge the whole pot. You don't need a scientific poll to know if it needs more salt.
Exactly.
Now, the third method the framework highlights is data-driven sampling, utilizing audit data analytics. This feels like the modern evolution of the process.
It is, and it fundamentally changes the scale of what is possible. Data-driven sampling leverages automated scripts, specialized analytics software, and increasingly machine learning algorithms to evaluate massive data sets before a human ever looks at a single record.
So the machine does the heavy lifting.
Right. Instead of randomly pulling items, you might run an analytic routine across 5 million database transactions to flag any transaction that occurred outside of normal business hours, originated from a foreign IP address, and exceeded $50,000.
Wow.
The algorithm identifies the anomalies, the outliers, the needles in the haystack.
And that leads perfectly into the fourth method, which is the hybrid approach. It seems like this is where you get the best of both worlds.
The hybrid approach is highly prevalent in mature audit environments. You use the data-driven analytics to sift through the millions of records and isolate the highest risk population. Say, you isolate all 5,000 of those anomalous foreign IP transactions.
Okay.
Then, because testing all 5,000 manually might still be too resource-intensive, you apply statistical sampling to that newly isolated high-risk population. You randomly select 100 of those specific anomalies for deep manual forensic review.
So you are using technology to define the target area and statistical math to ensure your testing within that area is representative.
That's exactly it.
It is incredibly strategic. But here is a section of the framework that I found particularly illuminating. After walking through all these powerful sampling methods, it explicitly outlines scenarios where you absolutely should not sample.
Yes.
It forces the auditor to step back and ask if sampling is even appropriate. The first scenario it mentions is when there are severe data or evidence limitations.
This goes back to the absolute foundational requirement of data integrity. If the system logs you need are incomplete, if the timestamps are corrupted, or if the IT department cannot definitively prove that the extraction query captured all the relevant records, you cannot proceed with sampling.
It's a non-starter.
You cannot build a mathematically sound conclusion on a foundation of corrupted data. Attempting to sample a flawed population only creates a false sense of assurance, which is arguably more dangerous than having no assurance at all.
Because then management thinks everything is fine when it's really not.
Exactly.
The second scenario where sampling is off the table is when automation or analytical alternatives are already actively in use.
This is a scenario we are seeing much more frequently. If Global Tech has implemented a continuous monitoring tool that automatically verifies the configuration state of every single firewall rule across their entire network every 5 minutes, traditional manual sampling is completely obsolete.
Because the machine is already doing it.
Right. Why would an auditor manually extract 50 firewall configurations to check for compliance when a deterministic machine is already continuously verifying 100% of the population flawlessly? In those cases, the auditor doesn't sample the firewall rules. They shift their focus to auditing the logic, security, and integrity of the continuous monitoring tool itself.
Right, you audit the machine checking the work rather than the work itself.
Precisely.
The third scenario involves the characteristics of the population itself. Sometimes the data just doesn't lend itself to sampling.
Indeed. If the total population is simply too small, for example, if a critical banking application only undergoes 4 major version upgrades in a calendar year, it is absurd to sample 2 of them. You just test all 4.
Makes sense.
Conversely, if the population is wildly unstable, constantly morphing in real time in a way that prevents you from capturing a reliable static snapshot, traditional sampling methodologies will fail. You have to find alternative ways to gain assurance.
And the final scenario where sampling is deemed inappropriate is when the risk or compliance stakes are extraordinarily high. There are certain things you just do not leave to probability.
There is zero tolerance for error in certain domains. If you are verifying the integrity of the core cryptographic key management system that secures a bank's entire digital vault, or if a specific federal regulation legally mandates the explicit verification of certain high-value wire transfers, you do not sample.
You check everything.
You perform full population testing. You test every single instance because the consequence of a single failure, financial ruin, severe regulatory fines, massive data exposure, that consequence far outweighs the cost of performing a 100% review.
The nuclear plant analogy comes to mind. But in an IT context, we are talking about the core ledger updates or the root access management systems. You don't sample the emergency shutdown protocols. You test every single one.
Exactly.
So, having navigated the philosophy of whether to sample at all, and assuming we have determined that a statistical sample is the right path, we enter the most rigorous phase of the process. We are moving into the design phase. How do we actually build this thing?
Designing the sample requires a meticulous, almost architectural approach. You are not just picking numbers out of thin air. The framework requires the auditor to start by unequivocally defining the specific purpose of the audit test. And this requires drawing a very sharp distinction between 2 fundamental types of testing: compliance testing and substantive testing.
I want to spend some time here because the framework emphasizes how different these are. If we are looking at compliance testing, the framework notes this is entirely about evaluating the operational effectiveness of a control. It is asking, is the safety mechanism functioning as designed?
Think of it as testing the guardrails rather than testing the cars on the road. When we perform compliance testing, we are typically looking to answer a binary question.
Like yes or no?
Did the system force the user to change their password after 90 days? Yes or no? Did the change management ticket receive formal approval from a director before the code was pushed to production? Yes or no?
Because the answers are binary, the framework directs practitioners toward what is called attribute sampling.
Correct. We are simply checking a sample of transactions to see if a specific attribute like a signature, a timestamp, or an approval flag is present or absent. It helps us estimate the rate of control failure across the population.
So, attribute sampling is for testing the guardrails. Substantive testing, on the other hand, is about looking at the cars on the road. It is about verifying the actual completeness, accuracy, and validity of the data itself.
That is a great way to visualize it. If compliance testing asks if the approval workflow happened, substantive testing asks if the dollar amount approved was actually correct.
I see the difference.
If an automated system calculates complex interest rates for millions of loan accounts every night, substantive testing involves pulling a sample of those accounts and independently reperforming the mathematical calculation to ensure the system's logic is flawless.
It's much deeper.
For substantive testing, we transition away from simple yes-no questions and utilize variable sampling. Variable sampling is designed to estimate the total monetary value of errors, or the quantitative impact of a deviation. We aren't just tallying the number of mistakes, we are calculating the total financial exposure caused by those mistakes.
Once that core objective is locked in, the framework dictates that you must rigorously define your population and your sampling unit. And this sounds simple, but I imagine getting it wrong is disastrous.
It is the most common point of failure in sample design.
Really?
The population is the absolute totality of the data you want to draw a conclusion about. The sampling unit is the individual item within that population that you will test. It could be a single user account, a specific configuration setting, or an individual system event log. The critical mandate from the framework is that the defined population must be perfectly aligned with your audit objective, and it must be demonstrably complete. If your objective is to test the security of all external vendor access, but your IT department accidentally provides a population that only includes domestic vendors and omits international ones, your entire sample is fundamentally flawed before you even select the first item.
That makes total sense. To manage these massive populations, the guidelines introduce a concept that I find incredibly elegant: stratification. It is essentially about recognizing that not all data is created equal and dividing a massive chaotic data set into logical, homogeneous subgroups.
Stratification is a powerful tool for driving both efficiency and focus. Instead of treating a population of 2 million user accounts as one massive pool, you apply logic. You slice the population into distinct strata based on risk characteristics.
And there's a strict rule about that, right?
Yes, the framework is very strict on one rule here. Every single sampling unit must belong to one and only one stratum. They must be mutually exclusive.
Let's apply this to our global tech hypothetical. How would an auditor stratify their user base?
An auditor might look at Global Tech's Active Directory and stratify the users into 3 distinct groups. Stratum 1 would be the highly privileged accounts, the database administrators and system architects who hold the keys to the kingdom.
The dangerous ones?
Right. There might only be 50 of these accounts, but the risk is astronomical. Stratum 2 could be standard employee accounts, thousands of users with limited access. Stratum 3 might be automated service accounts that allow applications to talk to each other.
Okay, so you have your 3 groups.
By stratifying, the auditor can intentionally heavily weight their sample towards Stratum 1. They might test 100% of the 50 privileged accounts and then take a smaller statistical sample from the thousands of standard accounts. It allows you to direct your finite audit resources exactly where the inherent risk is highest while maintaining the mathematical integrity of the overall population.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to the underlying mathematics of risk. This is where the framework gets highly technical. It introduces the concept of sampling risk.
This is a big one.
It really is. This is the inherent unavoidable danger that when you look at a sample, the conclusion you draw will be fundamentally different from the conclusion you would have reached if you had somehow tested every single item in the population.
Yes.
The framework divides this nightmare scenario into 2 specific types of failure: the risk of incorrect acceptance and the risk of incorrect rejection.
These concepts keep auditors awake at night.
I can imagine.
Let's start with the risk of incorrect acceptance. This occurs when the auditor pulls a sample, tests the items, finds very few errors, and mathematically concludes that the system is operating effectively. However, in reality, purely by chance, the sample failed to capture the massive systemic errors hiding in the rest of the population.
So they missed the iceberg.
Exactly. The auditor accepts a system that is actually fundamentally broken. This is the ultimate failure because it results in the auditor issuing a clean report, providing false assurance to management and regulators, while a critical vulnerability remains active in the wild.
That is terrifying. You are effectively declaring the bridge safe right before it collapses.
It's the worst-case scenario.
So the flip side is the risk of incorrect rejection.
Correct. Incorrect rejection happens when the population is actually functioning perfectly fine, but the auditor, purely by statistical bad luck, manages to randomly select the only 5 anomalous errors that occurred all year.
Wow, just terrible luck.
Based on that deeply unlucky sample, they conclude the entire system is failing. This causes massive, unnecessary panic. It forces management to launch expensive remediation projects, diverts critical engineering resources, and damages trust. All to fix a systemic problem that doesn't actually exist.
It's crying wolf.
Both scenarios represent a failure of the sample, but incorrect acceptance is generally viewed as far more dangerous because of the unmitigated operational risk it leaves behind.
To manage this, the framework explicitly ties sample design directly to the audit risk model. I was reading through this, and the interplay between the different types of risk is fascinating. The framework requires the auditor to calibrate their sample size based on their assessment of inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. Let's break that down for our listeners.
The audit risk model is the mathematical equation governing the entire engagement. Inherent risk is the natural underlying susceptibility of a specific process to fail or be exploited, assuming no security controls exist at all.
Okay, an example.
For example, a system processing international wire transfers has a massively high inherent risk compared to a system managing the company cafeteria menu.
Makes sense.
Control risk is the probability that the company's internal safety measures their firewalls, their approval workflows will fail to prevent or detect an error.
And detection risk is the risk that we, the auditors, will fail to find the error during our testing.
Precisely. And the framework establishes a critical balancing act. If the auditor determines that inherent risk is extremely high, and they believe the internal control risk is also high, meaning the environment is dangerous and the company's defenses are weak, they must aggressively lower their detection risk to compensate.
How do they do that mathematically?
by drastically increasing their sample sizes, deploying more sophisticated data analytics, or even moving to full population testing. If the environment is highly risky, your sample must be massive enough to guarantee you won't miss a failure.
Got it.
Conversely, if the environment is stable and historically secure, you can accept a higher detection risk and rely on a smaller, highly targeted sample.
And this mathematical calibration all builds toward establishing two absolute thresholds that dictate whether a test passes or fails: tolerable error and expected error.
These are the guardrails of the evaluation phase. Tolerable error is the absolute maximum rate of deviation, or the maximum monetary misstatement, that the auditor is willing to accept in the population without altering their conclusion that the system is reliable.
Is the line in the sand.
Exactly. If you set a tolerable error rate of 5% and your statistical projection suggests the actual error rate is 6%, the control fails. There is no gray area.
An expected error is what you anticipate finding before you even pull the sample, right?
Right.
Based on historical data, maybe last year's audit results, or recent changes in the IT environment.
Yes. And the relationship between tolerable error and expected error dictates your sample size. The mathematical logic is uncompromising. If you expect a high error rate, perhaps because global tech just forced a massive, highly disruptive migration to a new cloud ERP system, your expected error is going to be close to your tolerable error threshold.
Because it's a messy transition.
Because the margin for error is so razor thin, mathematical probability dictates that you must significantly increase your sample size. You need a massive amount of evidence to be statistically confident that the final true error rate in the massive population won't accidentally spill over your tolerable limit.
It is a delicate, high-stakes balancing act of probability and risk. Now, before we leave the design phase, we have to talk about the most modern addition to this framework. It explicitly addresses the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning into the sampling process.
This is such an important section.
The guidelines acknowledge that AI can be incredibly powerful for clustering data, identifying microscopic anomalies, and pinpointing exactly which high-risk transactions warrant human review. But it is very careful to outline the massive new risks this introduces.
It is arguably the most critical update in the document. The framework is very clear. AI is not a magical solution that absolves the auditor of responsibility. It is a highly complex, often opaque tool that requires intense, rigorous governance.
You can't just trust the black box.
The framework demands that auditors apply responsible AI principles. This means you cannot just feed a massive data set into a machine learning model and blindly trust the output. You have to ensure fairness, absolute accountability, and transparency in how the model operates.
And privacy, too.
Yes, you must implement strict data privacy controls, especially when the AI is processing highly regulated financial or personal information to determine the sample.
What struck me was the focus on technical integrity and model drift. You can't just validate the AI once and assume it works forever.
Absolutely not. The framework explicitly requires continuous monitoring for model drift. Let's say you train an AI model to detect anomalous transactions based on historical user behavior from 2024.
Okay.
By 2026, user behavior, macroeconomic factors, and IT infrastructure will have fundamentally changed. The data the AI is seeing in the real world has drifted away from the data it was trained on.
So it's basically learning the wrong lessons.
If you do not actively retrain and validate that model, its accuracy degrades silently. It will start flagging normal behavior as anomalies, or worse, ignoring entirely new patterns of fraud. Furthermore, the framework mandates transparency and explainability.
What does that mean in an audit context?
If a regulator asks why a specific set of transactions was excluded from your sample, you cannot say the AI decided. You must be able to mathematically explain the model's underlying logic, its algorithms, and its weighting systems. The auditor retains ultimate accountability. The machine merely assists.
So to synthesize where we are in this journey, we have established the foundational rules, we have debated the philosophy of sampling, and we have meticulously designed a mathematically sound plan that balances inherent risk, establishes our tolerable error thresholds, and properly governs any AI assistance.
We have a solid blueprint.
We have a perfect blueprint. Now we have to actually build it. We transition into the phase where theory collides with the messy reality of data systems, the art of selection. How do we pull the actual items without human bias or technical glitches ruining the entire design?
This is where engagements are won or lost. The guidelines focus heavily on avoiding bias and ensuring absolute representativeness. And it begins with a step that sounds administrative but is actually the most critical technical hurdle: verifying the population.
Verifying the population.
Before you execute a single selection command, you must validate the data extraction logic. You have to interrogate the SQL queries, the date parameters, and the system filters to confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that no relevant records were accidentally omitted and no duplicates were included.
This raises an important question about the fragility of data extraction, because it is so easy to overlook. We touched on this briefly, but let's dive deeper. Imagine you are auditing Global Tech's Global Payment Gateway. You ask the IT database administrators to extract all transactions over $10,000 for the entire quarter.
A standard request.
Right. The DBA writes a seemingly straightforward SQL query to pull the data, but there is a microscopic logic flaw in the script, maybe a syntax error, regarding time zones that accidentally excludes every transaction that occurred between midnight and 2:00 a.m. Eastern Time.
And just like that, the entire audit is compromised. Your mathematical design might be flawless, your stratification might be perfect, but you are applying it to a corrupted reality.
The foundation is cracked.
The framework explicitly mandates that the auditor must confirm data completeness and accuracy, typically by reconciling the extracted dataset back to the authoritative source system. You might compare the total row count of your extracted file against the live dashboard metric in the core application, or verify that the total dollar value of the extract perfectly matches the general ledger balance.
And if it doesn't map?
If those totals don't tie out perfectly, you stop. You do not sample from a broken population.
Garbage in, absolute garbage out. It is the bridge between theory and reality. Once you have mathematically proven your population is pure, you have to choose your selection technique.
Yes.
The framework breaks these down clearly. If you are operating under statistical sampling, you must rely on probability principles. And it lists 3 main techniques. The first being simple random sampling, where every item has an equal mathematical chance of being picked.
Simple random sampling is exactly what it sounds like. You use a validated random number generator to select items from the population. It is highly effective for homogeneous populations where every item carries roughly the same risk weight.
But the second technique is where it gets really clever, systematic sampling. And within that, the framework specifically highlights monetary unit sampling, or MUS. I was looking at how MUS operates, and it completely reframes how we think about a sample. Do I understand this correctly? It treats individual dollars, rather than the invoices themselves, as the units being sampled.
You have grasped the core concept perfectly. Monetary unit sampling is a brilliant statistical innovation designed specifically for substantive financial testing. In a traditional random sample, an invoice for $10 has the exact same probability of being selected as an invoice for $10 million.
Which doesn't make sense from a risk perspective.
It is highly inefficient. The $10 million invoice represents a massive material risk to the organization. MUS solves this by changing the definition of the sampling unit. The population isn't defined as 10,000 invoices. The population is defined as the 50 million individual dollars contained within those invoices.
So it is like a lottery system.
Exactly like a lottery. The $10 invoice holds 10 tickets in the drawing. The $10 million invoice holds 10 million tickets. Because the selection is based on cumulative monetary intervals, the mathematics guarantee that the larger, highly material balances are heavily favored and often definitively selected for review, while still providing a statistically valid representative sample of the smaller items.
It focuses the auditor's energy precisely where the financial risk is concentrated. It is elegant math. And the third statistical method is stratified random sampling, which we discussed during the design phase, pulling random samples from our distinct risk-based subgroups. But then the framework moves to non-statistical selection techniques, where mathematical probability is removed. The first is judgmental sampling, where the auditor relies purely on their expertise to target high-risk items.
We discussed this earlier with the post-merger integration example. Judgmental selection is surgical. You are selecting items based on specific risk indicators, unusual transaction patterns, or known control weaknesses. You are actively introducing your professional bias into the selection because your bias, your experience, is the precise tool needed to find the flaw.
But the second non-statistical method listed is haphazard sampling. And the framework defines this as the practitioner selecting items informally while attempting to avoid intentional bias. I want to spend a minute on the deep psychology of haphazard sampling, because everything I know about human psychology suggests that asking a human to be haphazard or random without a tool is nearly impossible.
It is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Human beings are fundamentally pattern-seeking machines. We are entirely incapable of true randomness.
We just can't do it.
If I give a practitioner a spreadsheet with 10,000 rows and ask them to haphazardly select 50 items, unconscious bias immediately takes control. Psychologically, humans will actively avoid selecting the very first item on a list, and they will avoid the very last item. They will subconsciously avoid selecting two items that are directly next to each other. They will often trend toward the middle of the screen or favor round numbers.
So even when we are trying our absolute best to be completely random and fair, our brains are secretly organizing the selection.
Exactly. And that unconscious organization destroys any claim to statistical representativeness. Because haphazard sampling is fundamentally tainted by human psychological bias, the framework explicitly warns that its results are strictly non-statistical.
You can't project those results.
You can draw a conclusion about the specific 50 items you haphazardly picked, but you absolutely cannot project an error rate to the remaining 9,950 items. The math does not support it.
That is a vital warning. Now, shifting from human psychology back to technology, the framework adds a massive layer of modern complexity regarding the tools we use to make these selections. We are running complex scripts and specialized data analytics software. The guidelines insist on strict validation of these tools. It mentions controlling access, verifying code versions, and documenting something called seed values.
The seed value is a critical component of technological reproducibility. When you use an audit software tool to generate a random sample, a computer algorithm generates those numbers. But algorithms are deterministic. They aren't truly random. They require an initial starting point, a numerical input, to begin the sequence of calculations. That starting point is the seed value.
Why is documenting that specific number so crucial?
Because the ultimate test of any scientific or mathematical process is reproducibility. If an auditor selects a sample of 100 transactions using a specific script, tests them, and issues a highly critical report that results in regulatory fines for the company, that company or an independent oversight board has the right to verify the work.
They want to see the proof?
If the auditor documented the exact script version, the exact data parameters, and the exact seed value, a completely independent third party can run that script against the original data and generate the exact same 100 random items. If the seed value is lost, the sample is lost to history. It can never be perfectly reproduced, which significantly degrades the defensibility of the audit.
It is the scientific method applied to corporate governance. And the technical challenges don't stop with scripts. The framework tackles one of the most difficult realities of modern IT: sampling in cloud-based and highly dynamic data environments. How do you sample a moving target? If you are auditing a massive distributed cloud infrastructure, say a Kubernetes cluster that is spinning up and destroying hundreds of containers every minute, you can't just pause the system to pull your sample.
It requires a completely different approach. You cannot rely on static databases. The framework dictates that auditors must define a stable point-in-time snapshot. You have to capture the data as of a highly specific timestamp, literally down to the millisecond, to essentially freeze a version of the population in place.
Okay.
You then sample from that frozen snapshot. But this requires intense coordination with cloud architects and system administrators to verify that the extraction mechanism itself is authoritative and didn't corrupt the data during the capture process.
But what happens when the cloud provider simply refuses to give you direct access to the raw logs? We see this constantly with major software as a service platforms. For security and multi-tenancy reasons, they block direct back-end database access.
It is a massive challenge, and the framework provides guidance on how to navigate it. If direct access is technologically or administratively blocked, the auditor must obtain alternative assurance through complementary controls. This often means relying on highly structured, independent assurance reports, specifically SOC1 or SOC2 Type 2 reports.
Let's briefly clarify what those are for the listeners.
Certainly. SOC stands for System and Organization Controls. A SOC report is an incredibly detailed audit report produced by an independent third-party audit firm that does have access to the cloud provider's backend. They audit the cloud provider's security, availability, and processing integrity and produce a formal attestation.
You lean on their work.
If you cannot directly sample a cloud provider's database, you can review their SOC2 report to gain assurance that their internal controls are operating effectively. Alternatively, the auditor might pull configuration baselines securely through an API or carefully evaluate formal attestations from the cloud provider's management.
But you still have to verify it.
The key is that the auditor must formally evaluate the reliability and independence of this alternative evidence. You don't just take their word for it. You rely on verified, independent mechanisms of trust.
So, we have navigated the design. We have survived the psychological traps of haphazard selection. We have validated our C-values, and we have wrestled the data out of the cloud. We finally have our sample.
We made it.
Now we transition to the final critical phase.
The execution.
Section 5. Evaluating results and documenting the truth. We have the data in front of us. What do we do when things go wrong?
The evaluation phase is where the auditor must shift from being a mathematician to being a forensic investigator. The framework is very explicit. When you test an item and you identify a deviation or an error, your job has only just begun. You do not simply put a red mark on a checklist and move to the next item. You are required to investigate the nature, the root cause, and the broader significance of that specific error.
Because all errors are not created equal.
Precisely. If you are testing user access provisioning and you find a form where the manager's approval signature is dated 1 day after the access was granted, that is an error. But you must ask, was this an isolated fluke caused by a manager being out sick and verbally approving it over the phone? Or does it represent a fundamental systemic flaw in the automated workflow software that is allowing active provisioning prior to cryptographically verifying the approval token?
Those are two very different problems.
An isolated human error requires one type of reporting. A systemic design flaw in the identity management architecture is a critical severity issue.
So what does this all mean? It means an auditor isn't just a checker of boxes. They are an investigator determining the root cause of an exception. And once you've categorized these errors, you have to figure out what they mean for the broader population. And this circles back to our earlier discussion about statistical versus non-statistical methods. If you designed a mathematically valid statistical sample, the framework dictates that you must extrapolate.
Extrapolation is the mathematical projection of your sample findings back onto the total population. If you utilized a statistical method and tested a random sample of 200 items out of 20,000 and you found a 4% error rate, you apply complex statistical formulas to estimate the total probable error rate or the total monetary misstatement across all 20,000 items.
And then what?
You then compare that projected total against the tolerable error threshold you established way back in the design phase. If your projected upper error limit exceeds your tolerable threshold, the system fails the audit.
But the framework issues a severe warning regarding non-statistical samples.
It is an absolute prohibition. If you utilize non-statistical methods, if you used your judgmental intuition to test 50 post-merger accounts, or if you used haphazard selection, you strictly, under no circumstances, may extrapolate those results statistically.
Never.
Your conclusions are mathematically bound to the specific items you examined. You can state definitively 10 out of the 50 high-risk accounts we targeted failed the control. But you cannot use that data to claim 20% of the entire company's accounts are failing. It is a vital distinction that protects the integrity of the audit report.
Now, what happens when reality refuses to cooperate? The framework addresses the need for alternative procedures. What do you do when the evidence you selected is simply gone? Let's say you pulled a sample of critical firewall rule changes. You ask the network engineering team for the approval logs for change ticket number 42, and they tell you that due to a server crash last month, those specific logs were permanently corrupted. You cannot just shrug and pretend the item wasn't in your sample.
Ignoring a missing item is a critical violation of methodology. If an item is missing, the framework dictates that you must either perform alternative audit procedures to gather equivalent evidence, perhaps interviewing the network engineer and reviewing alternative system telemetry, or you must formally select a replacement item using the exact same selection criteria.
You have to fill the gap.
The absolute key is that the auditor must gather the required assurance without compromising the mathematical integrity or the rigorous quality of the audit. You document the anomaly, adjust the procedure, and maintain the standard.
But there's another scenario discussed in the evaluation phase, which feels like the most dramatic moment in an audit. It is what we might call the nuclear option, stopping testing early.
It is a rare but highly impactful provision. The framework acknowledges that if the initial results of your testing are overwhelmingly negative, completing the entire sample is a waste of resources.
Let's paint a picture of this. Imagine pulling a sample of 50 automated invoice payments to verify that the three-way matching control is functioning. matching the purchase order, the receiving document, and the invoice. You begin testing. The first 10 are completely missing signatures or bypassing the control entirely.
It's a disaster.
By the time you reach item 15, every single transaction has failed.
At that point, the auditor's professional judgment must override the mathematical design. There is absolutely no logical or statistical need to spend the next 40 hours meticulously testing the remaining items. The control environment has demonstrably, unequivocally failed.
So you just stop.
The framework allows the auditor to halt testing immediately. You have acquired sufficient appropriate evidence of systemic failure. You formally document the catastrophic results of the initial subset, state your professional rationale for terminating the procedure, declare the control ineffective, and immediately escalate the critical finding to management.
It is a decisive action, and it all hinges on the final overriding mandate of the entire framework: documentation. The framework is relentless on this point. The ultimate goal of every single step we have discussed today is absolute reproducibility and transparency.
The documentation requirements are exhaustive because they represent the burden of proof. The framework lists exactly what must be committed to the permanent audit record, the precise operational purpose of the test, the mathematical definition of the population, the specific sampling parameters including confidence levels and expected error rates, the rationale for selecting the specific methodology, the detailed test results, and the finalized conclusions.
Every single detail.
If automation or data analytics were utilized, you must document the script repositories, the tool versions, the operating environments, and as we discussed, those vital seed values.
It is about ensuring that the work stands up to the harshest possible scrutiny. An independent reviewer, a federal regulator, or another qualified professional who has never seen the IT environment before must be able to read your work papers, use the same parameters, and get the exact same result. If the documentation cannot support that level of independent reproduction, the audit is fundamentally invalid.
And the framework doesn't just stop at the end of the engagement. It pushes the profession to continuously evolve. In the final sections, practitioners are strongly encouraged to engage in post-engagement quality reviews. They are pushed to continually evaluate their methodologies, to benchmark their data analytics tools against emerging industry standards, and to consult with specialized governance bodies to ensure their practices remain razor-sharp.
Because the technology keeps moving.
The technology moving underneath our feet is constantly accelerating. The methodologies we use to audit it must accelerate at the exact same pace.
It has been an incredibly rigorous journey today. We started by exploring the foundational ITAF framework and the delicate balance between recommended standards and professional judgment. We debated the philosophy of sampling itself, contrasting the cold mathematical certainty of statistical models against the seasoned, targeted intuition of non-statistical methods.
A lot of ground covered.
We walked through the meticulous architecture of the design phase, balancing inherent and control risks against detection risk to establish our error thresholds. We navigated the psychological and technical minefield of the selection process, dealing with flawed extraction logic and the complexities of cloud environments. And finally, we explored how to evaluate errors as forensic investigators, utilizing extrapolation appropriately and documenting every single step to the highest standards of scientific reproducibility.
It is a demanding, highly technical discipline, but it is the only viable mechanism we possess to establish genuine, verifiable digital trust in an interconnected world that has grown far too massive and complex for simple human comprehension. The IT auditor, armed with the discipline of this framework, is the vital bridge between that overwhelming technological complexity and reliable, understandable human assurance.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a concept that looks beyond the current horizon, something to mull over as you look at your own systems and data.
Indeed. We touched earlier on the integration of artificial intelligence and the shift toward continuous, real-time, automated assurance. As we move deeper into an era where highly sophisticated AI models and automated systems are capable of continuously monitoring 100% of a massive global enterprise's transactions, analyzing every log file millisecond by millisecond, we have to ask a profound question about the future of our profession.
A very big question.
Will the traditional concept of statistical audit sampling, pulling subsets of data to estimate the whole, eventually become entirely obsolete? Or will the IT auditors of tomorrow face an even more daunting challenge? Will they find themselves having to sample the complex, opaque decisions made by the AI models themselves to ensure the machines that are actively monitoring the machines haven't quietly, systemically developed a catastrophic bias of their own.
Who audits the automated auditor?
Exactly. Ultimately, as the systems govern themselves, who audits the automated auditor? It is a fundamental challenge that will define the next decade of digital trust.
What an incredible paradigm shift to consider. Thank you so much for joining us for this extensive deep dive into the architecture of IT sampling. We hope you walk away feeling equipped, deeply informed, and perhaps with a newfound respect for the invisible, rigorous logic that keeps our global digital infrastructure secure and trustworthy. Keep questioning the systems, keep interrogating the data around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.